The truth is I wasn't very good at being a signal officer, so they asked me to move on to the military police corps. And from there I went to public affairs because it's the same thing, you just meet people in better situations. But that was a beautiful slide program there, but it talks about 1920 going forward. And I want to go back 2 years to the summer of 1918. You saw a woman Marine there. About 2 weeks ago, I was at the Women's Memorial where they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of Women Marines. So on August the 13th, 1918, the Marine Corps took in its first women recruits. 5,000 applied. 5 were selected. They called them the 100% girls because they had to be perfect. And please don't mind if I use the word girls. I'm using the lexicon and the culture of the time. And I'll come back to that in several books later. But the Navy had already been recruiting women since March of 1917. When did the United States come into World War I? April of 1917. So about this time, in March, I think, of 1918, the Army starts to figure out that they need to get with the program. And they begin to recruit women as well. But what they're looking for are, and these are a very specific group of women. I'm not talking about nurses. I am talking about line soldiers. They wanted to recruit the first women. Oh, do you have my slides? Can we go to, yeah, we'll come to that. We'll go to the next one. This is the recruiting poster for the first women wireless experts, or as they were known, Uncle Sam's Hello Girls. There were 223 of them recruited. They were the telephone operators, the ones who ran the systems for the soldiers. Now, before that, there had been men who were operators. They weren't very good at it. They considered it women's work, and they didn't want to do it. And General Pershing realized that if you asked a male soldier to connect a call, it took over 60 seconds. If you asked a woman to connect a call, it took 10. Is this an easy choice? So they began to recruit women, and I'd like you to meet one of them. We'll go to the next slide. I only have 4, so 2 posters, 2 peoples. So this is Merle Egan Anderson. Now Merle was born in Colorado, grew up near Denver, and about that time only 15% of Americans graduated from high school. Merle had 3 years of high school, and then she went to work at a Denver hotel connecting calls. She was fascinated with that new thing, the telephone. She said, you know, I put a cord in here, I put a cord in there, and people in different parts of the world can talk to each other. I feel like I'm holding their lives in my hands. She loved it. She became a supervisor. They were all trained by AT&T, but she was not among the first to sign up because she didn't have the French language skill. And so she didn't think it was right for herself to try and join. But a few months later, when the Army relaxed the language requirements as they had more switchboards and more networks opening up in the battle area, she joined. She was in the 5th group that sailed to France in August of 1918. Now Merle was unusual in a number of ways. She was 5'11". This is at a time in the United States when the average man was 5'6". So when she is on that victory ship sailing towards France, an aviator came up to her and said, so what are you doing in that uniform? And she said, I'm going to fight for my country like you. And when she got there, she was in tours in France, working at connecting calls, and she was doing training because she had been a supervisor. And she was asked to train men who were going forward to some of the forward battle areas. And she had one sergeant who said, I don't take orders for a woman. And Merle said, really? But she also had the ability, she was empowered with her job. She was trusted to do her mission, and she was valued as a member of the team, as they all were. And so she put him on KP duty. After a week in the kitchen, they became very good friends, and he completed the training and went forward. Now, as you all know, the armistice is coming up in November, But most of these women did not go home when the first troops began to leave. They stayed to continue to connect calls, and Merle was one of the few who stayed behind to run the switchboard for the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. She went home to Helena, Montana in May of 1919 to a hero's welcome. Everyone was glad to see their girl come home. Out of those 223, over 30 received citations, some for bravery. One received the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, which had just been invented. But when Merle came home, and the next year the vote was passed, she had another problem. She and her colleagues were told they were not veterans and that they had never served. So they couldn't be discharged. The Army refused to grant her a discharge. The paperwork that you signed when you joined up said men, said males. You never served. No benefits. Now the Navy gave benefits to all the yeomen who served. The Army did not. And thus for Merle and her colleagues began a fight that would last 60 years. So she continued that fight with the VA, with the VFW, with Congress for any number of years. But we'll come back to her. And go to the next slide. Now I'll talk a little bit more about the Navy. So now we come to World War II with recruiting for the Navy and the Army, and again the Marine Corps. And in 1942, we passed the Women's Army Corps was invented, and the WAVES. Let's see if I get this right. The Women's Auxiliary Volunteers for Emergency Service in the Navy. Now, what is the Army and the Navy, what are they looking for now? Very specific recruiting. As we talked about communications networks, now we're looking to protect those networks, as many countries are. We need to protect our networks, we need to keep them secure, and we need to find out what's going on with the enemy. So the Navy began to recruit at elite colleges across the United States. At Vassar, at Smith, at some other schools. The Army recruited at a lot of state colleges looking for women with backgrounds in mathematics who had been teachers. Now at this time only 4% of women went to college. Now if you were going to be recruited, you got a letter that invited you to come and meet with a Navy recruiter, but it didn't say why. And when you did and you were interviewed, you were told if you ever spoke about it, you would be shot. So not many people talked about this. So if we'll go to the next slide, I want you to meet Elizabeth Bigelow. I don't have a good picture of Elizabeth, but she was recruited out of Vassar. And she was sure for many years that it was her professor who had recommended her. Her professor was Grace Hopper, a name you might recall as she invented COBOL many years later. And Elizabeth was studying to be an architect. But she answered this call and said, "Yes, I will," and raised her hand and joined as a Navy communications specialist. Now, there really wasn't a rating for this. The women who worked in this area were given Q as their specialty. Q stood for nothing. It was not just Elizabeth, but it was 4,000 women in the Navy in Washington working on these code-breaking missions. Over 80% of the code-breaking mission for the Navy was women. The Army had their own female code breakers. The majority of them were stationed at Arlington Hall Station. Anybody know where that is? Now the headquarters for what? The National Guard Bureau. And the women for the Navy were in what was then the largest WAVES barracks in the world. They were at what they called it the USS Mount Vernon. It happened to be in an old convent on Nebraska Avenue, now known as the headquarters for DHS. That many women in one place, they had guards, okay? Not sure if it was to keep the men out or to keep the women in, but it was a very carefully guarded place. One day, Elizabeth was given the charge of breaking a cipher. She had 2 hours in which to do it. She broke that cipher. It was the location of a Japanese convoy, and the Allies were able to sink that convoy. That was a singular act, but for the most part, these women worked in teams. They tracked the locations of the Japanese fleet, Allied convoys. They broke ciphers from the inner island to the Germans, they worked on the machines that broke the Enigma cipher. This is a picture of the operations there at the USS Mount Vernon. Now, when the war was over, Elizabeth and her husband moved to Cincinnati. She wanted to go back to school and become an architect, but she was told all of the spaces were held for men coming home from the war. So Elizabeth went in another direction. In a few years, she was running the entire computer system for the University of Cincinnati. She taught herself. So there are a lot of lessons in here for all of us. Firsts, there's a lot of firsts we don't remember. But if I were to say, look, I talked to DISA, we got a little swab, sent it off to Ancestry. This is DISA's family tree. These are the people who are the pioneers who built what later became the Defense Communications Agency, and what are those in your background who have built the DISA of today. Were they totally empowered with their jobs? By some, yes. Did they have doubters? Yes. But what their mission was undoubtable, what their mission was to achieve, to defend, protect and defend the United States. Were they trusted? Yes. And they trusted each other to get the job done. So even as Elizabeth is there in Cincinnati, Merle Egan is still involved in her fight. In the 1960s, she found an attorney named Mark Huff, and he said, I want to work pro bono on this, and I want to help. So he pushed, and by then, many of them are getting tired, don't want to fight anymore. And Merle said, I love my country, and I want my country to be worthy of that love. This is the right thing to do. He fought with her until the 1970s, when culture and times are still changing, and this came up before the Congress, and finally, in 1977, it passed. In 1979, there were 31 women still living who had served in World War I, and the Army sent a general officer to each and every one to present their discharge papers. So Merle Egan, who passed away in 1986, died as a veteran, with all of the veterans' rights and everything that went with that for her funeral. She achieved what she set out to achieve. All of them as pioneers did that. Their talent made a difference. What they did in changing that culture helped to push that 19th Amendment forward, and what it did was pave the way for everyone who came afterwards. So what I'm here to tell you today, and I have had a great deal of excitement and interest in learning about these stories, came from several books. One is called The Hello Girls, about the World War I wireless operators. And this will be a presentation at AUSA this year, if you go. They will show the movie, the documentary that was made from this there. The other book is called Code Girls. And don't get excited about the word girls here. This is New York Publishing. This is the thing now, since The Girl on the Train and the Gone Girl. We use girls a lot in color in the titles now. And a lot of the covers are now gold and silver and yellow. So when you look for books this fall, a lot of them will be yellow. Don't ask me why, that's just how they like to sell them. But these stories continue to be told. And I think it's important to remember them and important to keep telling them, because this is our history. We forget what happened 5 years ago. Did any of you know these stories from World War I? I didn't either. And I will tell you, last year, having seen the movie Hidden Figures, read the book, and gotten to meet the author, I said, where are the African American women here in World War II? And yes, they are there. And that is in that book, but not in any detail. So I went to go back and find more about that. But I thank you all for inviting me here today just to talk for a little bit about some historical things that I think are absolutely fascinating. I think you could do a great World War II tour through Washington, D.C. and go, you see that building that looks like nothing now? Well, let me tell you what it used to be. Thank you all for inviting me. Thank you very much.